Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is the murder of Gemma Hayter, who was a disabled woman who was actually failed by the system and brutally murdered by people that she thought were her friends. This was a suggested case by Natasha, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have. I would just like to let you know that I mean no disrespect to anyone I talk about today. I've just gathered this information from the internet to compile into a video for educational purposes. Gemma Hayter was born in 1983. She lived with her mother, Sue, and her stepfather. She also had an older sister called Nikki and an older brother called Neil. She lived with a family in Warwickshire, England, in a town called Rugby. From a very young age, her family noticed that Gemma was very different. Especially compared to her other children, she had a lot more difficult time learning, and she just functioned differently to her other children and other people. Her family used to call her Gem, and she actually was one. She was just such a sweet and loving girl who always saw the best in people and just loved being around friends and making friends, and that was just her main goal in her life. Growing up, she was a bit of a handful, like many children are, and she was described as a little troublemaker, but she was also this kind and beautiful soul. Her family began to suspect that she was actually on the spectrum from quite a young age, but they just had a really difficult time trying to get her diagnosed. She went for all these tests and they all came back as negative. She had every test possible and they all came back as negative. And because of that, she went to a normal mainstream school, and according to her school, she was coping really well. And that made her family really angry because they knew she wasn't able to do things like other kids could or as well as other kids could. She really struggled learning and the way she functioned was just different. And she was struggling, but nobody ever took her out of the school and nobody really helped her or did anything for her. And that's just sad. At the age of 14, she finally did begin attending a specialised school. It was the first time an institution had actually given her a place, because as I said, they just struggled to get any help at all. Even though she was at the school, her family still couldn't get her diagnosed, and so they just really struggled to get the right help for her. Things such as hygiene were just like an everyday struggle with Gemma, and those kind of things just didn't come naturally to her in her mind, and so she needed help. Her family really tried everything they could to get her the help and support that she would need. She had 29 contacts with learning disability services between the age of 13 and 19, and they tested her and said that she didn't have a disability. There was a lot of one doctor saying this, one doctor then saying, no, it's not that, it's this. One doctor, it just carried on like that, and nobody knew what was wrong with her. They would come out with something, and then one would say, no, because she doesn't do this, that's why she doesn't fit into that category. And she just didn't seem to fit into any category according to them. Because of that, she didn't get a diagnosis, and without a diagnosis, she couldn't get the right help tailored to her. She couldn't really get any help, actually, and it was a massive problem. She was forced to live a life in a way that wasn't normal to her, and it put strain on her and those around her. There was just so many failings on behalf of the system in Gemma's case. They didn't put any support systems in place for her, and Gemma never received any, and so it was really tragic because maybe, just maybe, I'm not saying it definitely is because no one can say that, but maybe it wouldn't have ended as tragically as it did if she had a support system there to help her and to guide her along the way in life. The council did an assessment on Gemma to see if she needed assisted living when she became an adult, and it came back that she was capable of living on her own. And around at the age of 24, she was just signed out of the system, never to be given support again kind of thing. Gemma herself actually wrote a letter to the council at 25 depicting all the things that she felt like she needed help with. So she was actually asking them herself, asking for these things that she needed, she felt like she needed help with, and they just did nothing. They still didn't do it. She decided that at the age of 25 she was going to move out, and they placed her in some flats. She was the kind of person that couldn't really tell if someone was not a nice person, and it made it really easy for her to become friends with the wrong kind of person, and that's pretty much what happened. She was just a very vulnerable woman who was very trusting and forgiving. And her mum said that even after this attack had happened, say that she actually survived it, knowing the kind of person that Gemma was, she would have just forgiven them for it. And that's just how vulnerable she was. After she moved out, of course, the family were worried for her. They were her only support system. The government did nothing. They didn't put anything in place. And so it was all up to the family, which it had always been. But it was easier when she was living at home. And now she'd moved out and she was becoming more independent. And so they were frightened, rightly so. It was a huge step for Gemma and she was really, really happy to finally become independent and she was excited to get her own home. Again, her family had this fear that was totally warranted because on the 9th of August in 2010, Gemma's body was found by a jogger. It was found on the unused rail track at 5:50 a.m. in Rigby. No one even knew that she was missing at the time of the discovery. She was found naked, having been terribly beaten. She had a bag over her head and was lying face down with her legs out straight and her arms bent with her hands facing palms out just like above her head. There was blood next to her body. She had a broken nose, a stab wound to her shoulder blade area on her back. She also had this mark on the side of her head that looked like a foot mark, so somebody had either stomped on her head or stood on her head at some point. The cause of death was actually ruled as drowning from her own blood from her nose injury. There were a total of 55 external injuries, including 17 just to her head and neck area, which included extensive bruising, areas of grazing and cuts, things like that. It was very much a murder that shocked Rigby, and it just had this really big impact on them. They couldn't believe that this had happened, that somebody had done this to poor Gemma, and the police began investigating into it. They tried to look at her whereabouts, her last known movements, and who she could have possibly been with. Her family stated that they believed that she was actually last known to be with one of her friends, who was called Chantel Booth. Police went to the apartment complex that she lived in, and also to Chantel's in the hope to find some CCTV. I believe Chantel lived about a mile away from her, so it wasn't too far. It was only then that the reality of how Gemma had actually been living was revealed to her family, because as I said, that was her only support system and she wouldn't even let them into the flat. She had no help and they had no clue about it all. I'll just show you some pictures of how she was actually living. So yeah, this woman apparently didn't need any help after her family had fought so hard to try and get it, and they never got it. They dug deeper and it seemed like where Gemma was actually placed in these flats, that there were a lot of people that lived there that were, let's just say, on the wrong side of the law a lot, and they put this vulnerable woman in there with them, which just isn't right. It was rumoured that her flat was being used by other people as drug storage. They told her that they were presents and she believed them, that she believed that they were their friends. That's all she wanted in life, and to her, even if she thought it was wrong because her friends were asking her to do it, it wasn't wrong, and so she just did it all. But like I said, she thought that these were presents and they were in fact drugs. And it's just awful to think that they were just solely taking advantage of her and she just thought that they were her friends. There were also reports that these friends would wait around as she withdrew her money, and they would go in the shop with her, and because she wanted to please them and do nice things for them, she would buy them things. So that is why they were there, because they knew if they were there when she withdrew the money, she would go in and she would buy them all these things, and they were just taking complete advantage of her. She would also go out and steal for them because, again, she was doing it for her friends and it wasn't wrong because they'd asked her to do it. So police do eventually get hold of some footage that shows Gemma leaving around Chantel's apartment with 5 other people, and they all appeared to be like they were all together. They travel down and eventually go out shot, but before they do, you can see Gemma is there and she has a tissue and she's blotting her nose. Now obviously you know that her nose was broken, and so that is most likely why she was blotting her nose, because it was broken at this point. They were also travelling in the direction as to where she was found. Between the times of 1:09 and 1:30, the group come back into shot and Gemma is not with them. Gemma's body was found 4 hours later. So they looked into these people who were supposedly her friends. Chantel, who was 21-year-old, she was actually living with her 19-year-old boyfriend, Daniel Newstead. There was 17-year-old Joe Breuer, and then there was another couple, Jessica Lyons, 18, and Duncan Edwards, who was 19. So this group of friends hung out with Gemma quite a lot recently, sort of before her death. Chantel had actually known her for the longest, I believe, and Gemma was just so happy to have her friend, but her family did think that Chantel's intentions were not the right ones, and they were worried that she would take advantage of Gemma. Chantel then went on to introduce Gemma to her other friends, the other group of people, and they would then hang out as a group. Now, these members of the group were actually known to the police for various different reasons, with Daniel Newstead being quite a violent and aggressive man, all of which isn't really a good mix for a vulnerable woman like Gemma. So the police go back and look at sort of 3 days prior to Gemma's murder, and they find that this group is all in Rigby Town Centre. They found out that they're all trying to get in this bar, and Gemma was quite a jokey woman. She had a good sense of humour, and she would often say jokes. And so jokingly, she says, oh, she's only 16 to the person, the bouncer, and because of that, she's not allowed in. Now, she wasn't. She was 21 and she was over age of the alcohol, but I don't know, the bar decided to not let them in anyway. I guess they assumed that there was some underage people in the group. I don't know. Either way, they also had this system whereby the group of pubs inside the town would all tell each other about underage drinkers, so they told them all to watch out for this group, and they pretty much couldn't get in any of the bars because of it. And it made them really angry at Gemma because of that. So her joke, which should have been taken as a joke, it was said in jest, it was said lightly, yes, okay, it caused them to not get in the bar. Who cares? You may be a little bit mad, but it was an accident and she didn't mean to do it, and so it was a joke at the end of the day. Yes, okay, you can't get into a bar. It's not the end of the world. But then the police find that on the CCTV footage, you can see that Chantel is physically pushing Gemma away from the group. She's telling her to leave, she doesn't want her there. And they took it a lot more heavily than was intended, and then they should have done, really. And then the group obviously try and walk away from her, which is just awful, because Gemma said a joke and she wouldn't have understood why they were now being like this. Chantel the next day then invites her 4 friends over. After drinking and smoking cannabis and things like that, they eventually invite Gemma over. This was via text. Now, I believe Gemma actually left her bag at Chantel's the previous day or whenever she last went, and she did actually want to go and collect it, but she didn't really want to go in there while everyone was there, probably because of what had happened a couple of nights before, and she might have felt a bit awkward or that she shouldn't be there, but Chantel eventually convinced her to go over, and so she did. And she just never ever returned home from there on out. Along with that, they found that her so-called friends never ever showed any emotion over Gemma's murder, over her being dead. So it was just strange, you know, they were supposed to be friends, so they were supposed to have cared about her, and they seemingly just didn't show any emotion over her murder whatsoever. So they searched Chantel's apartment. They're suspicious of her. They are the last known person to be with her on that CCTV footage. They don't care pretty much that she's died, and so they're the main suspects. When they search the house, they find blood on Chantel's radiator and strewn all up a wall. This blood was matched to Gemma's blood. They were questioned and they all pretty much had the same story, but they all just blamed each other for it. So they said on the night of the 8th, Gemma was thrown against a radiator, and that was where she most likely broke her nose and started bleeding everywhere, and obviously it splattered all up the wall and on the radiator. They also hit her with a mop at some point during the night. They then locked her in the bathroom and disgustingly filled a beer can full of urine and forced her to drink it. They flushed her phone battery down the toilet, leaving her utterly defenseless. She wasn't able to call anyone because her phone no longer worked. Eventually, they told her that they would walk her home, but that was not their plan, ever. They were never going to do that. So Gemma must have been elated. She must have thought that it was finally over. They had beaten her, they had abused her, and she just wanted to go home. And when they finally said that they were, she believed them, and she probably would have been really happy that it was finally over. So they leave, and that's when the CCTV catches them all going in the direction of the rail. They head over to the railway, telling her that it's a cut through, that they're going to cut through there and take her home. Now, that would have been the case if they would have turned left when they got down there. That would have led to her apartment. Instead, they didn't. They turned right. They then put the black bin over her head and beat her up. very, very badly. They beat her badly. They stabbed her, they stamped on her head. They then proceeded to strip her naked. They took those clothes and put them in a bin liner and they tried to burn them. They left her face down with this bag over her head, and as I said, she was bleeding and she drowned from her own blood. They killed her. 5 of her so-called friends murdered her in cold blood. Cases like these are actually referred to as mate crimes, and it's where people are abused, bullied, or harassed by other people who they consider to be their friends, who they consider to have cared about them. And it's just such a sad case because the system really failed Gemma and her family. They failed her throughout her entire life, and how it ended was just really tragic. Whilst waiting for a trial, Joe was writing how excited he was to go to prison and have all the luxuries that you do in prison, the TV, the games, and how many things he would have and how he could have and how he couldn't wait to be sentenced. As you can tell, they just didn't care. Literally didn't care about it or at all. Chantel Booth, Daniel Newstead and Joe Boyer were sentenced to life imprisonment and received 21 years, 20 years and 18 years. Jessica Linus and Duncan Edwards received manslaughter convictions and received 13 and 5 years. Their sentence were actually longer than people expected it to be because when involved in disability hate crime, the judge can opt to carry out longer sentences to kind of make an example of them and to basically show that they can do this if you do these kind of crimes, and that is exactly what the judge did. The Warwickshire authorities wrote a serious case review concluding that Gemma was actually at risk and suggested that the relevant authorities exchange details to try and prevent similar things from happening again. Her family do actually believe that if she would have received the help at the age of 25 when she wrote the letter to them herself asking exactly what she needed, that this probably wouldn't have ever happened. And it might have been the case because if she would have had somebody, say an assisted living, that would have been going into a house and helping her, she probably would have got talking to them saying that, or even seen people in there. They would have found drugs in a house. They would have known that she was being taken advantage of her. They may have even moved her because she was around people that she shouldn't have been around, being this vulnerable and essentially naive woman, no fault of her own. But she was susceptible to all of those things, and she thought they were her friends, and if somebody was in there helping her, then maybe they could have prevented it. Maybe they could have moved her, and maybe she would have been taught some kind of life lessons that could have prevented this from happening. I'm not saying that it would have done, because there's no saying it would have done. You know, she might not have listened, it might have happened anyway. But if that support was there, then it would have been a lot more helpful to her, and you just never know. Again, her family was her only support system and they really tried, but she just wouldn't let them in a house, and what more could they do? They can't physically break down a door and get in there, so they were just kind of left in the dark. Gemma was such a trusting and vulnerable young woman who would just do anything for her friends because that was all she wanted in life. She wanted friends, and they just took advantage of her, and they just stole her life when all she was ever trying to do was to please them. And it's just awful. But yeah, that's the end of the case. If you have any suggestions you'd like me to look into, let me know and I'll look into them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, please give me a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to see videos of similar content. But anyway guys, that's all I have today on the case of Gemma Hayter. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.